Laurel, you can start whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Well, it is my great delight to introduce the 2021 Selma Jeanne Cohen International Dance Scholar Lecture by Dana Tayson Burgess, who is a leading American choreographer and cultural figure. Born in California, he grew up in Santa Fe, the son of visual artist Joseph James Burgess Jr. and Anna Kang Burgess. His mother is descended from the very first group of Korean immigrants to come to America, and his family history is reflected in his work, which often focuses on the hyphenated person, that is, persons of mixed ethnic or cultural heritage, as well as the issues of belonging and societal acceptance. Dana began dancing at age 16 after childhood training as a competitive martial artist. So don't mess with him. He founded the Dana Tayson Burgess Dance Company in 1992 and has become the preeminent modern dance company in the Washington, D.C. area. In fact, Washington Post Pulitzer Prize winning dance critic Sarah Kaufman has called him a national dance treasure. He has been awarded 2 senior Fulbright Awards, and he serves as a cultural envoy for the US State Department, an appointment that he uses to promote international cultural dialogue through the global language of dance, performing, teaching, and choreography all around the world. In 2016, the Smithsonian named Burgess the first ever choreographer in residence. He's based at the National Portrait Gallery, where he explores the confluence of dance and portraiture. And as a matter of fact, the Smithsonian has 3 portraits of Burgess in their permanent collection. This year, he launched the provocatively named podcast Slant.com, which explores the lives and creative processes of prominent Asian American artists. He's the editor of Milestones in Dance History, which will be coming out in 2022, and his fascinating autobiography will soon be published by the University of New Mexico Press. Dana is a thoughtful artist and a generous mentor to emerging dancers and students. You will definitely enjoy his multi-faceted presentation today, and I will turn the program over to Dana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurel. It's a pleasure to be here. And I so appreciate that introduction. So what's going to happen today is that we're going to show a short video of a historic dance from 1916. It's just 2 minutes. And after that, I'm going to give a talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll do some live dancing as well by one of my company's dancers, Kristen Arthur, and answer some questions from our attendees. So if we can show the short video of the Michio Ito solo from 1916 of Pizzicati, performed by Connie Lynn Fink. much for showing that. So my lecture today is about serendipity, empowerment through embodiment, and a haunting. My Korean American mother and Caucasian father met in the early 1950s at the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. They married and ultimately settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Here, dance became my art, a kinesthetic language to express my inner emotional terrain. No doubt, my parents' artistic influences continue to guide me in my role as the Smithsonian's first choreographer in residence at the National Portrait Gallery here in Washington, DC. In the midst of the current resurgence of anti-Asian violence, I confront anew my own otherness, the collusions, as well as the collisions, as well as the rich confluence of my two cultures. How does the other, the hyphenated being or the transplanted person of another race or country of origin, not suffer their own alienation, ever on the outside, marginalized, excluded, deemed less than? Through movement, I address the questions, how do others resist and how do we adapt? And how does dance best serve as a storytelling medium, one that can inform, enlighten, and present potential understanding, empathy, and remedy? The medium is the message. As the late philosopher and seminal communication theorist Marshall McLuhan indelibly coined in 1964, that is, the very form we use to communicate ideas plays a crucial role in determining the impact of the perceptions, intention, reception, and the meanings of the message one seeks to deliver. I see physical movement as a social justice movement, in a sense, movement itself as a movement. Through the investigation of modern dance pioneer Michio Ito and his art and life, I have learned about the whitewashing of history and the systemic loss of Asian American stories. Ito's career points to the ramifications of shifting socio-political perspectives of the East between two world wars. I grew up in the 1970s in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a Hispanic neighborhood called Casa Solana, the place that faces the sun. My family was new to the established community. Our physical appearances were conspicuous. Here I would stand in the footprints of Michio Ito. When I was 9 years old, I jumped and ran and played with my classmate David Gonzalez in his front yard, whose boundaries were a chain link fence. One day, David's grandfather, who was sitting on the porch, yelled out, "Chinito," Spanish for little Chinese man. "With these metal fences around you, you look like the Japanese prisoners that used to be here during the war." I shivered and froze. His snicker at my ignorance was all the more chilling. He gave no further description of his memory, but I didn't play with David again. I asked my father what David's grandfather was talking about. My dad had been in the Navy during World War II and knew the man's reference. How could being Asian lead to being put in prison? I remember studying my father's stricken face and considered my angular cheeks and eyes, facial features so different than his. Were Asian features alone a reason that a person could be put in prison? Choosing his own words carefully, Dad explained that during World War II, yes, a prison for Japanese Americans stood on the land upon which our neighborhood was built. I was inconsolable. Many years later, I would learn that my father was referring to Executive Order 9066, which went into effect on February 19, 1942, just over 2 months after the December 7th bombing attack on Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the order, paving the way for the unjust and unilateral rounding up, removal, and imprisonment of over 100,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry in the United States. 2/3 were American citizens. The other third were of Japanese ancestry living in America, Canada, and Peru. Beneath Casa Solana, were the ruins of a former Japanese-American men's prison camp that had continued to operate until 1946. The camp imprisoned over 4,500 men, a number equal to 1/5 the population of Santa Fe at the time. Here in 1943, Michio Ito was imprisoned, having grown up on land that had been a prison camp would cast an indelible shadow of fear over my childhood that I could be imprisoned just for being Asian American. Michio Ito was born in Tokyo, Japan in 1892 or 1893. Records aren't very clear on that. His father was architect Tamakichi Ito and had received a Western education at the University of Washington. His parents were familiar with America and Europe, and this ignited their son's interest in the development of an East-West aesthetic. Ito planned to venture from Tokyo to Paris for music studies, but his background and interest in Japanese theater and dance led him to Germany in 1912, where innovative concepts were percolating about how music and movement could be merged. Ito was short, lithe, slight, with a black bob of hair. In Helleré, Germany, he trained in a branch of kinesthetics called eurythmics at the Émile Jacques Dalcroze Institute. Here, Ito was the only Asian among 300 enrolled students, an anomaly, an exotic Easterner. Dalcroze, a Swiss educator and composer, had designed eurythmics. Ito experimented with its application, performing in and soon choreographing productions that emphasize the facility of the performer to move on the specific beats of a musical score. But this revolutionary fresh institute would be short-lived, in large part due to the advent of World War I. In the summer of 1914, Émile Jacques Dalcroze took a trip to Switzerland and never returned to Helleré. When Japan declared war on Germany at the end of 1914, Ito left the school and moved to England. In London, Ito secured engagement at the Coliseum Theatre, where his appearances were advertised as the harmonious hybrid of European and Japanese dances. European tastes were focused on Orientalist art, fashion, and dance. The public's fascination with the East had been spurred on by resurgence of the interest in the vivid images of Japanese woodblock prints, or ukiyo-e, that had flourished in the 17th to the 19th centuries, and which now influence the works of Western painters, including Bert Degas, Vincent van Gogh, and Mary Cassatt. In 1872, French art critic Philippe Berti would coin this Western obsession Japonaism. Ito's dancing fed their sharpened appetites and imaginations, and arguably to their appropriations. Performing opportunities in London salons soon followed. Ito's edgy work attracted the admiration of poets Ezra Pound and William Butler Yeats and other influential artists and literati. They mentored the young modern dancer, and in 1916, Ito collaborated with Yeats to produce At the Hawk's Well, a one-act movement play presented in a pseudo-no drama format. No is a Japanese form of highly stylized theater that dates back to the 14th century and often features tales of supernatural beings. Ito danced the hawk, guardian of a magic well that bestowed immortality to any who drank from its water. His costume, designed by Edouard Dulac, featured wings and painted skull cap inspired by ancient Egyptian wall paintings of the god Horus, often depicted as half man and half hawk. A Japanese modern dancer in a quasi-ancient Egyptian guise, well, London audiences couldn't get enough of it. At the Hawk's Well was an artistic coup for both Yeats and Ito, but in 1916, England was paralyzed with the early quivers of World War I, and that precluded any sustained performance runs. That same year, Ito received a financially compelling contract from Oliver Morosco, an eminent American theater producer. But when he arrived in Manhattan, he instead was to dance in a musical sex comedy about two mate-swapping couples. He quit the contract, but now at least Ito had a New York base and he would pivot and build a following. In 1916, Ito created his signature solo, Pizzicati, which we just saw a few minutes ago, a short, visually arresting shadow dance, which he would go on to perform by popular demand throughout his career. He set the dance to composer Leo Delibes' Pizzicato, extracted from his full score for the ballet Sylvia. Ito danced Pizzicati in front of a massive golden screen, the reflective surface for his shadow. With a theatrical floor lamp placed at his feet, he was positioned in a wide second stance. An imposing 12-foot shadow was cast on the backdrop to accentuate his every hand flick, stabbing arm thrusts, and tracings. Ito's hair was coiffed in his signature black bob, his costume bespoke from the latest modern synthetic fibers, silver threads sparkling throughout his crisscrossed kimono top and black harem pants. His Asian garb was cinched tightly at the waist with a red silk obi. Pizzicati is stationary. The dancer never moves from his rooted spot on stage. Arms, hands, torsos, head, and intense facial expressions each accentuate the pinched notes through serial gestures that occur at waist or shoulder level and above the head. In a last grand arm flourish, the dance folds at the waist and is dramatically plunged into darkness, just as the spotlight blacks out on the last note of Delibes' score. Ito created solo dances for revue-style shows featured in exaggerated costumes from Egypt, Persia, China, India, Spain, and Argentina. For his idiosyncratic tango, he would wear a Spanish hat, cropped bolero, and tight high-waisted pants. To dance as if a Beijing opera singer, he would don an opulent red silk robe embroidered with gold dragons, platform boots, and an elaborate headpiece with long pheasant feathers and pom-poms. He would unavoidably fall into Western cliches of others. And yet Ito did not claim to have based these fabricated hybrid dances on scholarly research or reality. Instead, in a 1917 interview of Ito in the New York Tribune by Harriet Underhill, he elucidates his artistic reasoning, a desire to unify, while Underhill's words highlight the physical otherness of Ito. The article states in his dialogue, "So," he said, as he placed one little brown fist in the palm of the other, "you see this fist?" And you would say, "What is this fist made of?" We would see only the shadow, and we would say, "What does this shadow mean?" In my dancing, it is my desire to bring together the East and West. My dancing is not Japanese. It is not anything but myself. It is a series of poses. I am a sculptor, for I work, and I work over each pose until it means what I have it to mean. Underhill's racial colorization of his hand, a little brown fist, reinforces that she viewed the subject as different from herself, that he was not Caucasian. As Ito gained fame, his image would be portrayed by publications in ways intended to further accentuate his otherness. In 1926, an illustration by Carl Link of Ito in full Beijing opera regalia would be the cover of Dance magazine in February. The price for his fame was racial stereotyping. Ito taught classes in a rented studio above Carnegie Hall on 57th Street and 7th Avenue. His students would become famous leaders in modern dance, including Martha Graham. At 29, Martha Graham danced in Ito's The Garden of Kama, a work featured in the Greenwich Village Follies, a series of short dances inspired by images from the East. In 1928 and 1929, his touring included performances in California, which led to an invitation from the city of Pasadena for him to relocate his studio and headquarters there. Although by now well known, he had not become a financial success, and so Pasadena's offer lured him in 1929 to uproot from New York City. With financial assistance from the city, he relocated and set up a school and began to create large-scale productions, symphonic choreographies for the newly built Rose Bowl Stadium. In September of 1929, Ito staged the New World Symphony at the Pasadena Rose Bowl. This movement choir of 200 dancers was accompanied by the full symphonic Queen's Hall Orchestra. He closed the show by dancing Pizzicati in front of a 40 by 125-foot golden screen. Musical conductor for the event, Henry Wood, recounts the success of the solo. The dance itself was extraordinary, with only the upper portion of the body, the arms and head serving as the medium of expression. Recalled to stage, he performed the dance a second time. In California, he also restaged At the Hawk's Well. This time, Ito cast a talented and avid young acolyte, Lester Horton, as the Hawk, the role he had himself originated in London. Horton would later become an American modern dance icon in the 1940s and 50s, as well as become, in turn, Alvin Ailey's mentor. Ito's technique featured 2 sets of 10 codified arm and hand movements. One set he deemed masculine, and the other set he deemed feminine. Ito would expand his work into film as actor, director, and choreographer in Madame Butterfly in 1933 and Baloo in 1938. In Baloo, he was cast as the bare-chested chieftain of a primitive tribe in the jungles of Malay. But as the 1930s came to a close, anti-Japanese sentiment in America grew in tandem with global tensions leading up to World War II. On December 8, 1941, just one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US government arrested Michio Ito. His business and personal connections to prominent individuals in both Japan and in America suggested to a jittery republic that he posed a potential espionage threat to America. He had in fact been under FBI surveillance for months prior to December 7th. Ito was among the first individuals of Japanese descent living in America to be stripped of his human rights. He was initially held for 2 months at the Missoula, Montana Alien Detention Center. Here he was tried in February of 1942, and the board recommended internment. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that mandated the immediate rounding up and incarceration of over 100,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry, predominantly at the time living on the west coast of the United States. Ito was moved between internment camps at Fort Sill in Oklahoma and then to Camp Livingston in Louisiana. But Ito's final internment in 1943 would occur at the men's Santa Fe internment camp. From here, he would be unjustly deported to Japan, never to return to the United States. The remains of this camp were beneath my childhood home. In 1988, I was 19, an undergraduate student in the dance program at the University of New Mexico, and my dance history teacher, Dr. Judith Chazane Benaham, recognized that I too was the only Asian American student in the program, and that I was sorely in need of an Asian American mentor. And as a class assignment, she suggested I write a paper about Michio Ito. His story would nurture my dance journey, she said, and I had never heard of him. And even more telling, I had never even considered that there actually was an Asian American modern dance pioneer. In the library, I found images and descriptions of him and his dances in a book, Michio Ito, The Dance and His Dances, written by Helen Caldwell, one of Ito's former dancers. But just as the interconnections of his impact upon modern dance history were making sense, his story abruptly ended with a few cryptic statements, including, following Pearl Harbor, all Japanese were evacuated from the West Coast. After a brief internment, Michio Ito returned to Japan. I asked Professor Benaham what happened to him and why did he leave America when he had such a successful career, and her answer, the Japanese internment. Amazingly, my relationship to Ito went even further than dance and my neighborhood in Santa Fe. I learned that visual artist and designer Isamu Noguchi had been one of his closest friends. Because my parents were prominent abstract artists with connections to Asian artists of stature, as a child of 8 or 9, I'd actually dined with Noguchi on several occasions. Typically, he, my parents, and Noguchi's half-sister, Ilis Gilmore, who had danced for Martha Graham, would get together to discuss art. I was thunderstruck. Two of my parents' friends had been such close friends with Ito. The great inventive master of my idiom had been circling me my whole life. I concluded my college paper on Ito with the present words, "Someday I hope to learn the Ito dance technique and to perform his solo, Pizzicati." At 20, I moved to Washington, D.C. to pursue a professional dance career. I danced for both modern and neoclassical companies. Like Ito, I was young, slight, Asian American, with a black bobbed hair. Because of my anomalous looks, choreographers struggled to cast me in their Eurocentric repertoire. My Asian American identity and perspective were absent in the programming. I began to choreograph my own original work on a group of 8 Asian American dancer friends, and by 1993, I'd created a portfolio of dances that explored our Asian American family histories of immigration. I returned time and time again to lingering questions I had surrounding Michio Ito. How exactly had he choreographed? How had he trained and coached his dancers? What self-knowledge might I gain? I had to learn his technique and his dances before I could continue my own journey. To do so, I engaged my friend Hiro, a Japanese-American visual artist and civil rights activist. Hiro had recently designed a set for one of my dances, and so we could talk about Ito. She came from a prominent Japanese-American family and had ties with individuals who had been incarcerated during World War II. She connected me with 2 of Ito's former female dancers who serendipitously were living in the Washington, D.C. region. Lily Arakawa Okura, a soloist from Ito's California era, and Michiko Yoshimura Kitzmiller, who had trained with and danced for Ito in Japan after his repatriation. Hiro also connected me with Satoru Shimazaki, a male Ito dancer living in New York City who had trained in Japan with Ryuko Maki, a Japanese protege of Ito, who managed his dance school in Japan. Under their tutelage, my 8-member company learned the signature Ito masculine and feminine arm gesture series. And after a month, we had reached a technical proficiency, which allowed us and readied us to learn several of Ito's signature solos, including Pizzicati, which you just saw, and Ave Maria from 1914, which is his earliest solo, which you'll see in a moment. Each of these dances was short, 1 to 6 minutes in length, daunting in position. At breaks, Okura and Kitzmiller shared personal stories about Ito. Okura said he was a perfectionist who gave notes to each dancer, even when there were more than 200 in the cast. Kitzmiller said that for her solo Ave Maria, Ito had coached her every movement, hand placement, and even facial expressions. Ito's transnational philosophy that modern dance could lead to a mutual cultural understanding, a bridge between East and West, was in no dispute. The respect they showed Ito decades after dancing for him was unwavering. But it was hard to get past that veneration into certain parts of Ito, the man. Conversations always abruptly stopped when I broached the subject of his incarceration and repatriation. Was this silence molded from deep cultural shame for what had been done to them during the war? Was it perhaps combined with the fear that the Ito legacy would be stained if they spoke of it? Or was this place that was so painful, so profane for Ito, that they did not want to conjure and perpetuate his inconsolable sorrow? Their resolute silence affirmed that literally unspeakable pain, one that even after 50 years was still just below the surface. It was a surface that, for Ito, was literally underneath my childhood home. It wasn't until after our second public performance of the Ito dances in January of 1995 that during a post-performance question and answer session, the truth of Ito's feelings would be given words. Ito asked about the impact of EO 9066 on Ito, and Shimazaki finally replied, World War II tore out his heart and his life. It had taken the physical reanimation of Ito's work and the convergence of his devotees to assemble in a theater, a place of public healing, to acknowledge the traumas and erasure that Ito had experienced. After his deportation, Ito never returned to the United States. And although his career in Japan would continue, his eminence in the history of American modern dance was made to fade away. Michio Ito died in Tokyo in 1961, and I wonder, 60 years later, how modern dance would see Ito today if he had not been deported. Would dance students avidly study the Ito technique at studios and university dance programs across the country? Would students equally learn about the artistic importance of Michio Ito as they do Martha Graham? In our current national turbulence about race and otherness, around nationalism and who is not entitled to protections for their human rights and civil rights, I consider Ito's life and artistry anew, and I see Pizzicati's towering shadow as the intractable racialized politics that entangled Ito and eclipsed his American career. I believe his signature solo best encapsulates the metaphor of the negative societal and political pressures that continue to haunt the Asian body, the Asian American experience in America. Whenever I perform Pizzicati, I experience a feeling akin to entering battle, stoked with the specificity of the Ito technique and hundreds of rehearsals. I feel like David preparing to fight Goliath. Prior to the moment of performance, coiffed as Ito, cinched and costumed, I wait alone in the dark for the curtain to rise, the spotlight to illuminate, the music to begin. And this potent, anthemic work allows me to jab and punch and present ferocity and focus and determination and alacrity of body movements that defiantly rage against subjugation. The invisible enemy is no person, it is bigotry. The experience is cathartic, a rite that rids me of stereotypes of the often effeminized, hypersexualized, objectified, and vilified Asian American body. Pizzicati was never just a dance. Rather, it was a confrontation with societal stereotypes, systemic racist policies, and micro and macroaggressions that had chipped away at my identity and pride. Here, I am able to dance choreography that represents how I look and feel, that portray me as strong, and that are created by like-minded artists who also shared my deep sense of otherness. Pizzicati is actually a celebration of that very otherness. Ito's artistry has informed my belief that the reanimation of a choreographer's dances can be a journey of remembrance, resilience, and in this case, one of effective protest. Here is the transformative process of mentorship through movement resuscitation. Our society has an inherent discomfort with acknowledging its long through line of systemic racism. So now, each time I reset Pizzicati in a young dancer, I consider it a platform through which to openly communicate the long and troubled history of Asian Americans. Pizzicati is the tangible representation of the phantasm that America does not want to face, the erasing of Asian contributions to America in all of its history texts, in its artistic programming. Repertory can be perceived as the passing of movement knowledge from one body to another. And that is one layer of the skin. More deeply, more profoundly, and viscerally, it is the naked sharing of embodied stories of struggle and pain. Pizzicati has become a call to action, gestures that point to each observer, demanding the full acceptance of the civil rights of Asian Americans. Thank you. Next, what we're going to do is see Michio Ito's 1914 graduation solo from the Dalcroze Institute, and it will be danced and performed by Kristen Arthur, a beautiful dancer from our company. So we're just going to set up the music here, and I'll invite Kristen out. Thanks so much, Kristen. Thank you. That was beautiful. um, Next, what we're going to do is a little bit of audience participation, actually. And Kristen is going to demonstrate the Ito masculine arm movements. And it's something that you can even do if you're sitting down. You don't even have to stand up to do these if you're at a desk today, but optimally it would be great if you could stand. And so what we're going to do is demonstrate them, and then we'll run through them all together, okay? And so if we all lift our arms, and 1, 2, 3, 4. Position 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Next position, 1, 2, 3, 4. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Pressing 1, 2, 3, 4. And 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 back to 1, 2, 3, 4. And so Kristen just moved through our 10 arm positions of the masculine set of arm movements. You want to try them together again? Should we try all together? Okay. And here we go. And 1, 2, 3, 4. 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 Great. Thank you, Kristen. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. So the interesting thing about the technique is that that's a very, very basic arm structure, but those structures start to get more and more complicated because you can move them across the floor, they spiral, they go into the juxtaposition of one arm moving against the other arm, for instance. So, so you could go from one movement and then all of a sudden start going towards the next movement, but you start to cycle through on one side of the body at a time. So it becomes a real right brain, left brain sort of interaction that goes on between physicality and structure. So at this moment, I would love to open it up for questions and see if Laurel has any comments. And also I noticed that people were asking about more in the chat, were wondering about images of Ito. So many images of Ito are actually very copywritten and not that easy to get a hold of. But Toyo Miyatake was one of the main studios in Los Angeles, who was, of course, a Japanese photographer, amazing photographer, who also was interned. And his grandson did send me a photo. So while I'm answering questions, I'm going to search for that photo so I can pull it up on the screen for you. So Laurel.
Well, what amazed me is just how similar these are to some of the basic positions of Uzbek traditional dance.
Oh, fascinating. Really?
The positions are almost exactly the same. It's
uncanny. That's fascinating. I love that.
Yeah. So, and I don't think there was any cross-cultural influence, but I think the basis of there is a certain Asian aesthetic that is the through line. So that could be part of it.
Amazing. Mm-hmm.
Why don't we open it first, since I'm unable to easily access the chat? I didn't see any. You know what? Actually, I can't. Does anyone have any questions that they want to bring into chat?
I can also read them off if you'd like, Laurel.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. How can dance become more consciously an instrument of social change?
I feel that dance really is a fundamental language that bridges all socioeconomic and cultural and language divides, right? And so one way that we can expand that is to really have more projects that go into the community in terms of creating collaboration that will ultimately be performance collaboration and end within an artistic output. And I think that it's that collaboration, it's that conversation that occurs between artists in sharing what's going on in their communities and then sharing it with communities that leads to more empathy and understanding.
Another question from the audience: what more can Fulbrighters do as a community to share Ito's story? This person says, I didn't know the story at all, or nor the impact of the internments on the arts.
Yes, it's fascinating. I just thought I would bring up another issue. Many people know about Isamu Noguchi, but many people don't know that he did himself actually check into a camp and created a marble bust of Ginger Rogers while he was in the Poston camp. I believe it was the Poston camp. Maybe it wasn't. I think it was the Arizona camp. But it was interesting that he, in order to support his community and self-identify, decided to be in a camp. So the repercussions are just like huge, the reverberations of that time period. I think that one thing I've been thinking about in working on this book for Routledge, for example, called Dance Milestones in Dance History, is that I tell the Ito story in the chapter that I've written. And I think that really seeking out more inclusion within our educational structures to understand the long history of Asian American exclusion that has occurred, that goes all the way back to the Exclusionary Acts of like the 1800s, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's a very, very long history, and it's a complicated history. And yet I don't think that, I speak to young people now all the time at the university and high schools, and nobody is taught any of this. So I think our educational curriculum has to change.
Laurel, as a attendee, there's a lot of people on this call who are probably related to dance, but many who are not. You and Dana both talk about, as non-dance people, what should we be looking for when we see somebody dance? Like, what are some things that we should notice or not notice?
Well, wow, what a question. It's a great question. I look for partially for emotional expression because I work primarily with Eastern dance forms like Central Asian, Persian, even Arabic. And those forms are very expressive emotionally, and the whole range of human emotion. I'm thinking of something that Selma Jean Cohen told me. I had the opportunity to meet her, and I somehow talked her into going to my delegation to Soviet Uzbekistan back in 1989. And I was always frustrated because audiences had no idea about the cultures and countries and couldn't even find them on a map that I was trying to represent on stage. And she said that the artist needs to put into the program notes what they want the audience to know, what they want the audience to notice. So for every artist, it could be different. But I understand that there's less and less emphasis on having program notes now. And I think that's really a loss, because if people come in, they sincerely want to know more, want to learn something about it, but you've got to guide them through this new territory. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure Dana has ideas too.
No, I agree with that. And I think that where there's a disconnect is between, of course, understanding the history of the dance forms that are, the outcome now is the contemporary dance that we see now, for example, or the culturally specific dance forms, but not presenting or understanding the lineage. And the lineage is where all of the stories of the history of the world lie, right? All of the political histories, all of the social histories, the personal histories. And that's how we can understand how dance has become what it is to this day. And I think, you know, scholarship is so important, but so is the actual embodiment and the excellent embodiment, not just the scholarship. Both of those things have to be in tandem. And that's something you do so well, Laurel, of course.
Thank you.
I wanted to share this photo because I noticed in the chat someone asked, could I show another photo of Ito? And this is a photo which Alan Miyatake, Toyo Miyatake's grandson, said that I could share today, which is so kind of him. He, of course, has the plate. So let me try and do this. Can you see that image?
Yeah, it looks great.
Oh, great. So this is Michio Ito. This one is actually from the 1920s when he's doing pizzicati. And you can see that costume, you can see the spotlight and the shadow. And this was his signature piece. And of course, here's Koyo's signature at the bottom. And that studio, it's so fascinating to me, is still a photographic studio that the family runs, and a wonderful group of individuals.
A question about that that technique from the audience. Says, was that play on light and shadow prevalent at the time, or was that something new?
You know, what was happening at the turn of the last century is that there were individuals playing with the concept of technology and of light. So there was an artist named Loie Fuller that was a little bit earlier than Ito, had these huge, massive pieces of silk, and she would have constructed these different changing light colors that would kind of make her look like she had big wings of a butterfly, for a better way to describe it. And so, you know, that was in the air, right? Because the world was changing. And of course, all this technology was then, you know, going to move through into a world war. Yeah.
In the past few years, have you felt, this is from the audience, have you felt as an Asian American better accepted or respected in light of the Black Lives Matter movement to bring light to injustice of Asian Americans? And also a comment is that, assuming that the pandemic hasn't helped at all, but in the last couple of years, how have you felt about your identity?
I think that what's fascinating for me in talking to all of my Asian American friends and friends with Asian ancestry is that right now is a moment of mobilization. But it's unfortunate that the mobilization is happening because of the resurgence of anti-Asian violence, right? So we have a long history of that occurring to our communities in different ways. And this is a moment where I think all of us are trying to figure out how to be part of a larger American dialogue and really world dialogue about this. In terms of other communities, there's a long history of the relationship and alliance between the Black Power movement and the Yellow Power movement, which really supported one another. And I think that that's something that is very important for all of us to continue to create alliances and allegiances across all communities.
Some of these comments aren't questions, they're just saying they really loved your presentation. But we do have another question here. Would you speak to the often thin line between cultural appreciation and appropriation? We often jump into a new culture with so much zeal that we might end up offending or misappropriating that culture. How can we be sensitive to that possibility and still feel free to explore and be receptive to a new culture?
I think that's a huge conversation that's going on now, right? Is the reconsideration of, for instance, in modern dance or the history of modern dance, you see the modern dance, the earliest modern dancers, and Ito's sort of the anomaly because he's coming from the East to the West, but the Western modern dance pioneers were so influenced by their interest in, for example, archaeological items and explorations that were going on from the Mediterranean to North Africa to the Far East all the way to China, right? And so it was these images that were feeding their exoticized interests. And so you see a lot of the early modern dancers wearing, for example, Greek garb, traditional Greek garb, or you see them in traditional South Asian dance outfits, or fabricated images from the Far East. And it's so, I think one conversation I had recently was fascinating, I asked a bunch of students, like, what do you think about seeing this video of, and it was Ruth St. Denis, and she was in sort of South Asian traditional Indian garb doing this solo that was, not culturally specific dance form. It was her interpretation, right? And the students said they can see that it was a different time, that it was a different world with a different, more naive view of how to interact with individuals, but that the thing to do is to acknowledge the appropriation and acknowledge the actual lineage and how the initial images of modern dance came into being, right? So I thought that was an interesting and appropriate answer.
Maybe after the presentation, there's been a lot of requests to have like links to Ito and
Sure.
more information, maybe just like a link to the Wikipedia or
absolutely. And the National Portrait Gallery has a nice, where I do a lot of work, has a nice page on Michio Ito because they have several wonderful portraits of him.
Do you have any advice to an aspiring Fulbrighter who wants to do dance research or participate in a Fulbright grant in the future?
Oh, I always say to young artists and young scholars that they should be very true to their interests, to not sort of get pulled aside by something that might seem like it's something that's like current and or like kind of like a sexy subject matter, right? But really think about what it is within your life you're seeking, what is your journey, and follow that in scholarship. And so in doing so, making sure to research what are some potential organizations that you really could have impact in, and have a dialogue where you learn as much as you want to share, right, with another community. And I think it's all about finding that correct community organization match to the passions of what you're interested in finding out or expressing.
Thank you so much, Dana and Laurel, for doing this panel. If you have any last words, go ahead. Otherwise, we're bumping up close to the time in just a couple minutes.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much to the panel that was kind enough to allow me to give this lecture today. And also I'd like to thank all of the audience members and of course the staff at Fulbright who's been amazing. And I also wanted to mention that I'm here today at the Historic Arts Club of Washington, which is the oldest arts nonprofit in Washington, DC. So I appreciate their space. Thank you.